Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are live here from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, with thanks to the Knight Foundation for their generous support. Just a reminder to our internet audience, if at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you can call the store at the number on your screen, order a signed copy of the book, which can be sent to you for no charge for the shipping anywhere in the U.S. For those of you that are here, please silence your cell phones, and don't forget to pick up a copy of our Books and Books newsletter. I realize January is almost over, but you can pick up a copy of this. This will give you a breakdown of all the wonderful events we have at Books and Books. This can be found on the counter where the books are being sold this evening. You can also go to our website at booksandbooks.com for further information about the future events. We present an average of about 60 events every month, sometimes 4 a night. We usually have something for everyone. There are Spanish events, kids events, poetry readings, first-time authors, and celebrity signings. When you visit our site, please give us your email address so we can keep you apprised of all that goes on here, and that way you won't miss a thing. And also, don't forget to visit our newest Books and Books location at the Adrian Arch Center downtown, right in the historic Sears Tower. We have a beautiful new bookstore and cafe there, so please make sure you put that on your agenda. Tonight, we are very happy to have with us Sande, Boritz, Berger, and The Sweetness. After 2 decades as a scriptwriter and video film producer for Fortune 500 companies, Sande Berger returned to writing fiction and nonfiction full-time. For years, she attended the Writer's Voice in New York City and writing conferences at Stony Brook Southampton College, where she once got lost driving Joyce Carol Oates to a dinner in her honor. Ms. Berger's stories and essays have appeared in a multitude of publications, including the Southampton Review, Confrontation Literary Review, Tri-Quarterly Magazine, and Epiphany. Ms. Berger has taught creative writing as a volunteer at NYU's Medical Center Rusk Institute's Pediatric Division and recently completed an MFA in Writing and Literature at Stony Brook Southampton College. She's here with her wonderful new novel this evening, The Sweetness. Please give her a warm welcome, Sande, Boritz, Berger.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Steve. Thanks a lot. I can't believe the turnout. It's wonderful. I'm so excited, and I'm going to get right to it. A lot of you have already asked me questions, so I hope that I cover it. And how did I get here? Well, let me tell you. I got here. Art Garfunkel didn't get here. I left New York on Sunday, and I was supposed to fly in on Tuesday. So I think it's beshert that I'm here tonight. I also got here the day before the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. I did not plan that. I did not plan to be reading about this book. I did not plan that the book would be finished on that time, but I do also believe that that is fate, and that was meant to be. How did I get here? Well, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I think from a very early age I did. But I also wanted to be a dancer. I wanted to be a singer. I wanted to be an artist. But writing was the one passion that I did not abandon. But at a young age, I hadn't written very much at all. So I think it was really the lure of books that really got me into writing. And in other words, it was other people's writing. But in my childhood home, except for the books that my father kept hidden in his night table, which were books like Peyton Place, Masters and Johnson, there was a lot of Harold Robbins, and I must say that his favorite book was Kerouac's On the Road, which I did not understand at the time. But except for those books, my parents boasted their collection of Reader's Digest condensed novels. Now, I don't know if you remember them, but they were these big, fat books in pastel colors. And the reason why my mother liked them is because they matched the blonde woods of our 1950s furniture. They sat in our den right next to the Doers and a big bottle of Chivas Regal. And I always, when I read one of those, and I read Sound and the Fury, or I read something by Hemingway, it always felt like I was missing something. So I was lucky enough to be able to get to the library nearby. It was walking distance from my home, and that's where I really discovered books. That was my second home, as it was for a lot of my friends. The same people for years sat at those library tables. Now, I don't know if I was a nerd, but I know that I was shy, I was quiet, I was awkward, and it was in the library and among those books that I found some peace. At home, it was difficult because I shared an upstairs attic room with my brothers who did not understand the meaning of boundaries. One of them is actually here today. It was only after they knocked themselves out and went to sleep that I could settle down and read some of those books that I had checked out earlier. I always was intrigued by the lives of real people. I loved any stories about presidents, inventors, heroes, and heroines. I thought that I enjoyed anything that had bravery or humanness in it, and I liked reading about their families. I mean, for me to understand that Abe Lincoln actually had a family was so big. Ben Franklin and Dolly Madison, that she would throw these terrific parties in Washington, D.C. I imagined that when I grew up, I could do anything I wanted. I could possibly fly an airplane. I could maybe I could cut off my hair like Joan of Arc did at 15 and save the world. But none of that happened. Then, a short time later, I became very interested in poetry. But I will admit the reason why is because Carl Sandburg's niece sat next to me in third grade. And I read the poem recently, and it's "The fog comes on little cat's feet." And I just started thinking, well, the fog comes on little cat's feet. Why didn't he say the fog creeps in on little cat's feet? So I'm already started rewriting Carl Sandburg. Eventually, after that, I began writing short stories. But most of my short stories were very dark. I don't know why, but for some reason, I attempted tales where suffering and tragedy seemed to play a major role. Death always seemed a lot more interesting to me than the drudgery of normal life. Although I didn't speak any French, I loved anything noir. Then, like most girls, I began writing in a diary. And I think that was because we all read The Diary of Anne Frank around 12, 13 years old. But I was cautious because I knew that diaries could be read and that their locks could be mysteriously broken. So it was out of necessity that I often scribbled my words and my thoughts and my longings between the leaves and the vines of my rose pattern wallpaper. And that was the time I really believed that I truly became a writer. Those thoughts were very private. No one would ever climb up on a chair to find those words that I wrote. But years later, I was shocked when we drove by that childhood home and saw that it had been completely demolished. And in its place was this postmodern monstrosity that was perched on a quarter-acre lot. I was heartbroken. All I could think about were those epithets and those yearnings as if they were some hieroglyphic lost to the world. Obviously, the world got along very well without them. George Orwell said that one of the motives of writing is egotism, a desire to seem clever, to be talked about after death, to get back to grown-ups or others who snubbed you in childhood. While this might be true for some, it's really not the motive behind my writing, which brings me to the sweetness and how the story evolved. As a child, I had the privilege of living across the street from my maternal grandparents. They were folks that had immigrated from Lithuania around 1915. It was there in my grandmother's kitchen where I first had the sense that there were so many secrets and stories not meant for my ears, and why, of course, I became very interested, although they spoke in hushed tones and used that funny language called Yiddish. Someone always tried to usher me into the little bedroom off the kitchen, you know, the one that always smelled of mothballs. But from here, I would flatten myself out like a noodle and eavesdrop under the small space under the door. And I grasped just enough to be both terrified and yet curious by the sudden outburst of weeping. It would take years to really put together all the pieces of my family's stories and all the missing parts that triggered my imagination and led me to fill in the blanks. Then, one day, about 10 years ago, I was helping my elderly aunt sort through some old documents. I think she purposely gave me this particular box to look through that day, but I can't be certain. It was one of those old-fashioned cookie boxes. And inside is when I found the picture of the girl named Rasha. And there was also a telegram that announced Rasha's birth. And there was a photo of my grandparents, all dressed up in what had to be their last trip to Europe before the war broke out. Of course, I had lots of questions from my aunt, but she said very little, and I know to push would have really upset her. But what I do remember her saying were the following words. "I should have stayed," she said. "I never should have come here." "But if you had," I answered, "you would have been killed." And then she said the strangest thing. She looked more like a belligerent teenager than a 95-year-old frail woman. What she said was, "So what? So what?" And it was as if her 80 years in America had been nothing more than just a handful of scattered seed that never took root. I'll never forget how she looked that day. The sorrow was etched across her face. And a few years later, after she passed away, I began writing a story. I began writing that story in a class, in an MFA program. One of my MFAers is here today. It was Rasha's story, which I would eventually alternate with one that I had nearly completed, and that was the family story about people that I loved and I knew. And then Rasha, somehow, merging in that other story, led me to understand, and things became clearer. And what it was that at the end of her life, my aunt, once again, like so many people, had to face all those choices that she had made, all the haunting regrets that evolved just from merely surviving. And it was through the writing of the sweetness that I slowly began to grasp the reasons why. Survivor guilt is a force that endures, whether within the context of the tragic wars of yesterday, the tragic wars of today, or the ongoing trauma within a family. And even though I'm a second-generation American, survivor guilt would become the motivation for this book. I wasn't aware of it then, but I certainly became aware of it. And it's a trickle-down effect. And I felt I had the responsibility to tell this story and what I learned to the next generation. I'd like to read a chapter. It's a short chapter, but they all sound long when you're reading them. And to set it up for you, it comes early in the book, and it's called Avram Returns to Sadowa Street. Now, Avram is one of my, I would say he's not a major character, but he's an important character because he has a conscience and he has guilt, and he is a Jew who has been appointed to the Judenrat, which was the Jewish council. And for a long time, the Jewish council felt that they were safe. But many times the Jewish council gave away Jews to save themselves. He's married to a Polish Catholic candle maker, and her name is Marta. And one day, she in the marketplace, she's suddenly given an envelope by a Jewish family, the Kaninskis, and eventually she hides the child in their root cellar. And this chapter begins, it's in Vilna, Lithuania, and the chapter that I'm going to read to you begins when Avram goes back 2 weeks after the roundup, the first roundup of one of the 3 ghettos that was in Vilna. And he goes back to look for an envelope because he's told that there is something there that he has to get for the child's care. So I will read. The sushi was very salty. Okay. Walking the eerily barren streets, Avram wondered why he was so foolish to believe that things might stay the same, that all his privileges might continue, even though there were fewer and fewer of them. Them. Wasn't he one of them, still a Jew? Or had he, in order to survive, adopted the demeanor of the SS soldiers involved in the daily actions of the Special Council, controlling and manipulating lies. He had heard of incidents whereby committee members were ordered to execute other Jews as a way to gain favors for their own family, but he had not yet seen this firsthand. Avram refused to believe rumors born out of fear or speculation. Certain he was still being used, he knew that pride could not coexist with the desperation for survival. He had been coached by others in his position. You do what you have to do. You keep your eyes straight ahead, as cold and icy as theirs. Yet everywhere he went, Avram heard the enemy's bold pronouncements of ongoing slaughter. Who would be next? Whose kin divided and sent away to die? The agonies would only be prolonged if sent to one of the death camps, where the fumes from the gas chambers filled the lungs of those left. The SS patrolled everywhere. He saw them standing, slouching, staggering in gutters, intoxicated from the liquor confiscated from the musty rooms of what had been an abandoned city. His first time on Sadawa Street, the evening following the roundup, Avram realized he was about to take his privileges to another level when climbing the 3 flights to the Kaninsky's abandoned apartment. His heart thumped so hard he wondered if he might explode. If caught, he was prepared to say he had noticed lights behind the lace curtains and thought he better investigate. He found himself skulking through the narrow streets of the largely populated Vilna ghetto, feeling nauseated and guilt-ridden. His position on the newly formed council would not allow him to perform miracles. Many of the people who he and his father had known for decades had already mysteriously vanished and were presumed dead. Their swift migration never imagined. Mementos of those full lives, once lived in freedom, lay in the gutters like refuse. Everything had been ransacked by the soldiers and hoarded, depending on its value. He left the ghetto quickly that first night, fearful of being halted and delayed for questioning. Yet he knew he would go back. He had given her his word. All this and more he had done and would still do for her, his Marta. He had never known another human being with a more gracious soul than his pleasingly round, soft-hearted wife. Avram had never been as good with people. 15 years later, he still questioned why Marta had accepted his proposal for marriage. She came from a family of hard-working dairy farmers who had had little time to practice the stringent rituals of most Polish Catholics, unlike Avram, born into an observant Jewish family and 3 generations of cabinet makers. To be good with one's hands to his late father-in-law meant to be able to fix the bent blades of a till or the treads on a tractor while maintaining all your fingers. Who would have guessed that the biggest gift Marta could give Avram, besides his children, was that she had been born Christian. Although he was a well-respected cabinet maker whose merchandise adorned the homes of many wealthy families, it was because of his wife that the children were not labeled Judeans. To feel good about that often filled him with guilt and dismay. His family had stopped speaking to him when he had announced his plans for marriage. He was the first in the history of Juraskas to marry out of his faith. But it was Marta who eventually went to his parents' home in Belarus to make peace and mend her husband's family. On the 3rd try, the stern couple finally asked her to stay for dinner. Slowly they warmed to her, and then after Victor's birth and her promise to have the boy circumcised, Marta was welcomed, but always with cautious affection. Now on his return to Sadawa Street, nearly 2 weeks later, Avram noticed a pair of broken eyeglasses, coins, a soiled scarf, a child's shoe, and the eerie head of a doll as he entered the swastika-signed building where the Kaninskys once resided. He was struck by the deadly silence, unlike any silence he had ever known. It was as though the same sad collective record played on each and every Victrola, when suddenly the needle became stuck in its groove, spinning indefinitely, waiting for someone's hand to lift that needle, someone who had once loved beautiful music. Once inside the Kaninskys' finely decorated apartment, Avram found himself struggling to breathe. Lingering in the thick, humid air was the pungent smell of the family's last Sabbath dinner, the tablecloths mussed and stained, a rotting pear lost in the oversized silver bowl. Feeling like a thief, he slid open the buffet drawers and found the flatware and linen still intact. Everything was organized in a way that promised an immeasurable future of Sabbaths and celebrations. And then there were candles, melted but not indistinguishable. They were ivory-colored, pure and thick. His Marta's candles, of course. And now he was standing here, looking for what exactly? When he tried to open another drawer, it jammed. Avram's curiosity took over. And when he yanked the drawer open, a slew of sepia photographs toppled to the floor. He bent and reached for them, noticing the shots of men and women, some wearing large-brimmed hats and posed alongside a fancy automobile, the make of which he could not identify. In the background, reminding him of a small castle, stood a beautiful brick and stucco home with windows of interesting shapes and trims. He grabbed the photos and placed them under his shirt, against where his heart beat furiously. In the corner of the room was a child's bed, what he realized must have been where Rasha had slept. The bed was unmade, and 2 square satin pillows lay scattered on the floor. He sat down on the bed, immediately aware of the thickness of the mattress. Not one complaint from the girl who slept now on an old sled, converted into a cot. He must figure a way to provide more comfort, lest he ruin the child's frail bones. The envelope from Mr. Kaninsky had said to look inside the pantry, where there was a large bag of flour. He wondered if Mrs. Kaninsky had known the contents of that letter she squeezed into Marta's hand on that day in the marketplace. Here is your payment for the candles and for the lovely new table your husband crafted for us. Thank you for everything, she'd said to Marta. If he were Rasha's father, he too could never have told his wife of his plans. She would have kicked and screamed before parting with her child, any of them, even Victor, the most difficult, the angriest of souls. Avram found a paring knife in a drawer and slit open the only bag of flour. He knocked over a few cans of boxed food to draw attention away from the heavy sack in case someone suddenly barged in. As soon as he split open the bag, he became immersed in flour, his pants a dead giveaway of some strange treasure hunt. Then, just as he was about to bolt out the door, nerves gripping the muscles in his chest, Avram's fingers bent into a hard, papery lump. He slid a folded envelope from the sack and shoved it deep inside his pants. On the cupboard door, someone had thumbtacked colorful postcards from America. He glanced at them, noting the return address, a fish market in Brooklyn, one from Paris, then shoved them in his back pocket along with an address book he grabbed next to an open jar of apricot jam sitting in the sink. His stomach churned with nervous indigestion. On his way out, he shamefully took an apple that must have rolled underneath the dining room table. A small but beautiful table, he thought, admiring the quality of his own workmanship. It had taken him months to complete the French-inspired furniture for the Kaninskys. This was a table he and Marta could never have afforded. He was a carpenter who owned little carpentry, crafting wood for whoever was willing to pay for his artistry. From the street below, he heard voices bellowing in the night air. Avram peeked through a crack in the living room window and saw 3 soldiers directly across the street, hoisting the body of an elderly person into a horse-drawn wagon. He guessed that the person, male or female, with pure white hair, had stayed behind when the others came to evacuate the ghetto. Perhaps they had chosen suicide, deciding to control their own fate rather than to die at the hands of Hitler's beasts. Reality struck like a fallen beam. If caught and interrogated, he'd better have a solid story, or his body might find its way into a wagon or a shallow ditch. Furious now, he grabbed 2 tiny vases and stuffed them in a small velvet cushion. Before leaving, he glanced back at Rasha's bed. A crocheted blanket swept the floor. Maybe he'd come back for the blanket and inspect the grandmother's place as well, though he guessed that would be nearly impossible. He was aware of the quiet, which at another time might have felt peaceful. Once outside, he had taken no more than 20 steps when out of the narrow alley, someone shoved him hard from behind. He gathered himself quickly, trying to stand as straight as he could. The commandant, a fellow not more than 18, with a fresh air face splattered with russet freckles, demanded that Avram show his papers. As he handed them over, he felt the envelope left by Mordecai Kaninsky shift inside his underwear and slice painfully into his groin. When he tried to adjust his pants, the postcards and address book fell to the ground, but he dared not reach for them. "What is that smell?" the officer said. And that powder." The commandant licked one finger and placed it on Avram's pant leg, then tasted it again. "Baking goods? Have you been cooking, Mr. Juraska?" He let out a squeal of laughter, though not for a second did Avram let down his guard, especially when he eyed the Luger hanging from the young man's belt. "Ah, looks like we have a full moon," he taunted. Avram nodded in agreement, afraid to breathe. He imagined the children back home in their beds. Rasha, the girl filled with terror, the smell of potatoes, rhubarb, and celery root nauseating her tiny stomach. Sophie, making presents for Rasha. Victor, dreaming of pranks to try on the young boarder, all alone in the chill downstairs. Avram folded his papers and stuffed them back in his pants pocket. "Not so fast. Tell us what you're doing with these." "I found them in the street, right over there." Hands trembling, Avram got mixed up, pointed in the wrong direction. "Put down that pillow and empty your pockets at once." So this is the young German youth, Avram thought. How easy they had learned the art of intimidation. He watched, knees shaking, as the soldier held up the vases, both l'hommage. Though the star was probably lost on this mere child, he wanted the stash anyway. "Thank you for the gift," he said, smirking, and Avram noticed how his left eyelid drooped lazily, as if half of him was falling asleep. He thought of killing him then, slitting his throat, and watching the blood saturate the stiff collar of his uniform. Only a sliver of Avram believed his special appointment mattered, which had given him a false sense of hope that his family would be spared. Within weeks of joining the council, Marta had surprised him with an 8-year-old pale little girl wrapped in soaking sheets who was to be hidden away in their root cellar. A child appearing so shaken she remained mute for nearly a week. Some days he thought of himself as sewage. Wasn't that what you call someone who was about to steal from a child, an orphan? Mordecai Kaninsky had left more than a decent sum of money for his only child's care. The envelope Avram would hand over to Marta spoke of special needs, things like Rasha's terrible fear of the darkness, and when she learned that, how Marta would make sure to bring the girl candles every Friday night to remind her of the Sabbath. Finally, they allowed Avram to leave. He knew not to look back or stoop for the postcards or address book lying in the gutter. He could only remember one postcard with a picture of the Eiffel Tower, but nothing else. Once he returned home, Avram counted out half the money from the powdery envelope and stowed it away in his tool shed. He placed it in a rusty can that he filled to the brim with heavy nails and screws, and on top of it he placed a silver mallet. The rest he stuffed inside a pouch. This money he would use for household expenses, especially when all the supplies dwindled to nothing. He convinced himself that all of his actions fell into the realm of self-preservation. He could not let his own go hungry. After all, by hiding the child, hadn't he and Marta risked their own lives? And so for the first time in his life, Adam Juraska felt shamelessly entitled. Thank you. Okay, who has a question?
You read another chapter.
Linda? What? Hi.
Another chapter.
Oh,
Very good.
thank you. How many have read the book? I know a few people have already. Oh, good. Thank you.
So it was based on a true, was it based on a true story?
Well, it's inspired by true events, and it's certainly inspired by my maternal grandparents. And I don't want to, do any spoilers here, but this is a real person, and she is actually my second cousin, and your second cousin.
How long did it take you to write?
Well, or, let's see, decades. I started the book. It alternates chapters. It goes between the child that's in hiding back to Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn story and the Brooklyn family had enough of a story that I thought that was my book. And then I entered an MFA program in 2005 or 6, and in 2009 I finished the book using both and merging those two tales. So it took a long time, but in between I did write another book that I have almost ready to go. Almost. Never really ready. It's only ready when somebody takes the book away from you. Yeah.
Were you able to research the family in Vilna, and were you able to get much information other than just the letter apparently that you found?
I researched what I needed to know, and I was shocked to find what I needed to know. When I found it, I was shocked. But today you can find a lot. There's so many websites where you can go and find it. Yeah. And the research also, Yad Vashem, there's an office in New York, downtown on Fifth Avenue. And the Nuremberg trials, there was a lot that I read from the Nuremberg trials to actually really learn what happened in Lithuania. Lithuania was one of those places where in 1941, in the summer of 1941, the population went from 225,000. By the end of the war, it was less than 20,000. So it was one of the hugely destroyed communities, Jewish communities. I believe it was called the Jerusalem of, right, Lithuania? Yeah, Vilna was the Jerusalem. Yeah. Oh, I did write that in the book. Okay. Now I'm quoting myself. Anyone else? Anybody confused? Because I'd be glad to.
You do a great job of clarifying the two different families and stories.
Okay. It's funny, some readers can't wait to get to the chapters in Lithuania, and then some people, really depends on age, I think, and our ages, because the Brooklyn story is a very 1940s fall-in-love story before one of the characters, based on my father, enlists in the Navy and shows up one day on the front porch in Brooklyn, Avenue T, Ocean Parkway, if anybody's from Brooklyn, and shows up in a Navy uniform. And the World's Fair is in it, and the movies they loved. 39 was Gone with the Wind, and also The Wizard of Oz. And, so I used a lot of that, and that was research, a lot of research, and music.
And were the aunts your aunts?
Loosely based on my aunts. One of them would not be happy right now, and she was actually my favorite aunt. But she had what we call shtickla. So, I took traits from different people. Really. I have a cousin, God, I love her, who wasn't even born yet, but she's very angry that she's not in the book. Even though she wasn't born, she's angry she wasn't in the book. So.
Put her in your second book.
Yeah, that's an idea. Yeah. Thank you. Anything else?
Curious, do you have a pattern for writing? Do you write first thing in the morning? Do you write every day, or do you just write when
Yes, those patterns about writing. I should ask my friend here, Patrick, who's a wonderful writer and has a novel coming out.
Well, it's in Kaylee's hands right now, so.
Oh, good.
Hopefully, if not the end of this year, the first of next year.
Great.
January.
And, you know, when you have other jobs, like you teach, right? It's really difficult unless you're home all the time. I mean, I work on projects at crazy hours. I like to work on short projects because that gives me a sense of completion. I like to do essays, sometimes related to this, to promote the work. But as far as waking up at 6 in the morning, working till 12, that doesn't work for me. It really has to hit me. And I don't like writing at home because when I write at home, I suddenly find myself alphabetizing the cans of vegetables and finding all kinds of excuses not to do it. So I know I have to get out of the house and go where there are other writers. And I have written a lot in Starbucks, there were diners, there were places. I just can't be home. I can't be home, so. Yes.
You've had the pleasure and fortune of working with other great authors and like the late great Frank McCourt. How has, you know, your, I guess, tutorship with him kind of impacted at all, you know, the structure of this novel, or, you know, when you are writing, you know, what have you learned and how has that helped you?
That's a good question because I thank Frank McCourt in my book because I got accepted into his class. He was teaching a memoir class, and he taught it for 2 years. And he accepted me even though he wrote to the head of the program, I'm taking her in this class even though she's writing a novel and not a memoir because it sounded so autobiographical. But when I studied with him, one of the things he said was, get to the hot spots. He wrote that across the board. If it's uncomfortable, if it feels uncomfortable, then you have hit a place where you have to stay. And he would write words on my paper like focus, because I was kind of all over the place and I was avoiding issues. And that works wonderfully for memoir. And memoir is terrifying to write. It's just terrifying. And, you know, lots of times we will turn to writing fiction so we can avoid that, having to write it. And he said, if it's uncomfortable, you're on the right track. So, yeah, that's what I learned from Frank McCourt. Yes.
Tell us about your methods of writing. Do you use a word processor? Do you use cards to keep thoughts in order? Do you have outlines?
I'm probably the most disorganized person in the world. I wrote every single word of this book by hand in notebooks. I have 30, 40 notebooks from this novel and another 30 from another. And I'm paranoid because I always think I've left the notebook in a restaurant or a store. And first thing I do when I buy a new notebook is I write an entire letter to the person who finds it if I leave it. But I was always terrible with typewriters. I hate sitting for a long time, so I just found I could put a notebook in my tote bag and I could go off for the day and I could write 3 chapters. In the early days, what I did is I found great typists that charged very little, could understand my writing, and within days they would send me a draft that was done on a computer, and I always did all my editing from that draft that was on the computer. But as far as sitting down and writing a chapter, there's some connection that between the brain and the hand that works for me creatively. And I found out, I was also, as you know, Joyce Carol Oates' assistant, and she wrote every single one. I think she's turned lately to writing on word processors and computers, but she wrote all of her books, probably 100 of them, by hand. It's just the way some people work. I wish I could sit down and I can do essays that, you know, sitting down, or a short story, but I cannot do something that's conceptual and has lots of characters. I do have to start at one point in the process taking notes to remember that this character has blue eyes and not brown eyes, and give them character traits. I gave the boy in this book, he has a walk where he lifts his foot up, and without saying that he had polio, I tried to hint that he might have that, and that's what makes him so bitter. So I have to remember to, carry that through. Things like that.
How long did it take you to get this published?
Oh, how long did it take to get it published? Well, the process is, that is the most difficult process, because while you're doing that, there's no creativity and you really can't really write. You're obsessed with that. So they tell you to get an agent. They tell you, and that they are the people who have already gotten the agents, And I gave myself a period of time to do that, and I came really, really close. And I would send 3 chapters, and then the agent would ask for the entire book, and then the agent would have the book for 2-3 months. And then I got to a place where I would sell multi-submission, because I wasn't going to wait 10 years. And then I started hitting some independent presses, because the independent press started to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And not only that, it becomes a community of writers. And so when you're writing and you're publishing, you're not alone. You have a support system. And that is what worked for me. And I finally, for this book, I would say 3 years to finally get it. And it came out. I actually started working on the book last February on vacation. And because it's an independent, it came out in September. And they gave me 3 or 4 different book covers when I was away on vacation. They sent me 3 or 4 book covers, and I was saying, no, I don't want 2 little girls with pigtails skipping through a field of corn. It just doesn't work. And I finally, I don't know why, I had this picture the whole time. And then one day I took it out, and I figured out, and it was it. It worked, so. But that part can be grueling. Anything else? So we can have wine and cheese and sign, and there are books, there are bookmarks. I think you have to buy the book and have a bookmark. Thank you so much for coming, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. For those of you who are still watching online, don't forget you can give us a call here at the store. We'll get a book signed for you and ship it to you. For those of you that are here, we have the books for sale behind the counter. Sandy will sign them for you here. I ask you to fold your chairs as you stand up. That way we can get some room in here. Thank you all for coming.